I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello horror hounds and welcome to my horror house. After talking about the Omen and Damien Omen II last week, the next film was inevitable as sure as 6 follows 6 follows 6. I always really liked the tagline on the cover of the novelisation, which was slightly truncated for the poster. The power of evil is no longer in the hands of a child. Damien Thorn is 32. It's Omen III, the final conflict. Damien's all grown up. Isn't that really all you need to know right there? I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the unique framework for this horror trilogy, more akin to something like the Godfather movies than any other horror film series that springs immediately to mind. David Seltzer, who wrote the first film, turned down the opportunity to write Omen II, but years later he said he would have set the first sequel on the day after the end of the first movie, with Damien still a child but now living in the White House. But honestly, what would that have been except for much more of the same? I love the time jumps between each movie. The fact that these three films chart the span of Damien's life and chart the rise of the Antichrist to power, his career, so to speak. And by this point, what a career he's having. Just seeing Damien Thorn in the Oval Office with the president pulling on invisible strings sends a mythical chill up my spine. For me, the politics and the behind-the-scenes manoeuvring are some of the most successful aspects of a film which, honestly, of the three, is possibly the weakest. It's certainly the most different. It's in the background, it's bubbling away, but it's absolutely there. Thorn Industries needs new footage of its relief work for an ad campaign, so they manufacture an attack on the Aswan Dam to ensure that their relief workers are first on the scene. Damien uses bogus intel on the identity of the attackers to brew up trouble for Israel and all of those potentially apocalyptic nuclear warheads in the area, and he uses that bogus information as a deal sweetener to leverage the President of the United States of America into awarding him the post of ambassador to the court of King James and the head of the UN Youth Council, all while allowing him illegally to retain control of Thorn Industries. It's all quite subtle stuff, and I get that some viewers might think it's dry and maybe even equate it to the talk about trade federation negotiations in The Phantom Menace, but I find it incredibly insidious and chillingly plausible. I will say this though, as much as I love the globe-spanning web of evil, we are told that the world is in the grip of a great recession and is in an unprecedented state of chaos. I would have loved to have seen even a hint of this global upheaval and turmoil, but sadly it is absent. Everything seems to just be ticking along quite nicely, thank you very much. I also really like Damien as an adult in full control of his powers. Now we get to see Damien Thorn in all his pomp, and he's so much more evil, so much scarier. Not movie scary perhaps, but real world scary, if that makes sense. In a very weird way, what with the manipulation of finance, global politics, and the media as is portrayed in this film. The final conflict, at almost 40 years old, weirdly becomes a film of our times. And I really do like Sam Neill's performance. Darkly seductive, slightly sardonic, dangerously sexual. But I do feel it's lacking maybe in a couple of areas. His supposed romance with the female journalist Kate Reynolds, I get the impression that there was an intention perhaps to have Damien on the path to fulfill his destiny, and perhaps a Beauty and the Beast scenario, and could he potentially fall in love with a human woman, and might that derail his plans and derail his destiny, might it undo him? That sort of put on the back burner for a few slightly more Omen-like moments. And there's also one key scene where he's praying to Satan, to his father, essentially, in his secret chapel at his home. And there's no need for Damien to have any pretense or to have a public mask. And perhaps in the performance Sam Neill gives, I was hoping for a little bit more, dial the performance up a little bit. Maybe not to a level of Nick Cage magnificence, but I feel that section when he's talking to Satan felt a little bit flat for me. Admittedly, the lines he's given to say are pretty much all duds, so he is working with some fairly chunky material. He's much better when he's in an imaginary conversation with the Nazarene, the Christ figure that's his enemy. He sort of comes to life then when he's talking at him or against him. It feels like he's getting there a little bit more when he's talking to the disciples of the Watch. I like the little touch of him throwing up the horns when he's speaking to them. He's takes on a more regal and selfish and self-righteous persona, and I like that. A little bit more of it when he's praying, though, would have just gone that extra mile for me. So you have an attempt to make an Omen movie, and you've also got this other story, I would say a more grown-up story going on. And the older I get, the more chilling I find the ideas behind the story to be. None more so than what I refer to as the second slaughter of the innocents. Damien's King Herod moment where he has all of the boys born on a certain day between a certain period killed in a preemptive strike against the second coming of the Christ. While all the murders of the newborns take place off screen or are just outside of the frame for obvious reasons. This isn't a Serbian film, for fuck's sake. This surely has to be the darkest, most fucked up and purely evil territory the whole Omen saga has trodden across all three films. I've seen some commentators say that this segment verges on the comedic, even Python-esque, and I can see where they're coming from. It's maybe a little bit too much, one little vignette after another, all ending with a sort of punchline of a baby being killed. There's a close association between horror and comedy. I guess you're either going to have to laugh or you're going to have to scream. I think if you were going to pace these baby murders out rather than montaging them in one section, sort of containing them so it's a little bit more palatable, it would have had more impact. But honestly, it would have been unrelentingly grim. I mean, really fucking horrible if every 10 minutes or so we're reminded, yep, babies are being killed up and down the country. And so it's the ideas behind the execution of this that I find horrible. The administration, and that's sort of personified in the character of Harvey Dean, like an accountant at Auschwitz. Don Gordon plays Dean, Damien's personal assistant and press aide, a fantastic representation of the mundanity of evil, the business, literally, the day-to-day admin of running a demonic empire. Dean is aware of his boss's true identity, complicit, but doesn't seem like a true believer, and that rings true to me. Not all of Damien's followers are going to be religious zealots. They're just going to be in it for the bonuses and the boons that come their way. But at some point, characters like Dean made a choice, probably a small choice at first. He took a step along the path, then another, reaping the rewards, justifying transgressions, following orders until he finds himself drawing up a list of newborn baby boys for execution. Make no mistake, I don't find this Python-esque at all. This is the pogroms, this is ethnic cleansing, these are the concentration camps, and this is how we get to them, not with huge ideological leaps, but little steps, one after another. I know that the final conflict is not well liked, and I feel a little bit maybe like I'm making excuses as to why I like this film. I see all three Omen films as a whole, and while I acknowledge that there are bits of the final conflict that just seem a little bit off, I'm glad we get the culmination of Damien's rise and the end of his reign. I'm glad we get to see it capped off. I'd have felt that there was something lacking if we'd have just had 2 films and then nothing. As an Omen film, it doesn't feel like an Omen film for large swathes. I think it's telling that it was originally simply called The Final Conflict, and then later on Omen III was appended to it to sort of bring it into the fold. I mean, it's clearly the third part of a trilogy. It shares absolute continuity with the 2 films that came before it, apart from the shifting chronology of what happened when, so that each film can take place in a sort of fictional now. Yet, even the film's original official title, changed later to include Omen III, seems to be declaring that it's something apart from those other 2 films. It's a film of ideas rather than a gruesome series of deaths. So, strangely, the gruesome series of deaths, which bind it sort of more closely in spirit to the first 2 films, seem like the most out of place part of the final conflict. That's not to say it doesn't have its moments. The spectacular suicide of the incumbent US ambassador to Great Britain is about as omen-y as anything you could get in all 3 films. The little detail of his foot tapping after he shot himself is phenomenally gruesome, as are the sort of twitching death fingers of the first monk who's burned alive whilst hanging upside down, wrapped in plastic. Yet many of the other deaths are bloodless or off-screen. The idea of Damien blooding Kate's young son after the fox hunt is where this film's jam is, not showing a monk being ripped apart by 3 dozen hounds. But we have DiCarlo and his 6 other monks. I guess we need some sort of human antagonist for Damien to face off against. That kind of seems like a holdover from the other 2 films. I won't be the first to note that the monk's plan is a little bit off. We all know from the first film that the first dagger of 7, the daggers of Megiddo, extinguishes Damien's physical life, but all 7 are required to completely destroy him. So when after decades you've finally got all 7 daggers back together and at your disposal, you don't then hand them all out and separate them off again. The monks seem to be set up primarily to provide a threat to Damien, as well as a conveyor belt of victims for him to off in the grand tradition of the franchise. Yet the final conflict seems a little embarrassed about their role and pulls back from just producing a great run of set-piece deaths, which the previous 2 movies sort of revelled in. It means perhaps the final product is a little bit of a halfway house between what they really wanted to make and them second-guessing what the audience of an Omen film would expect and want to see. Doesn't mean that the final conflict doesn't add to the great iconography of the Omen franchise. Maybe less than the first 2 movies, but I really dig Damien's Dark Chapel and the statue. He's got the perversion of the crucified Christ that he interacts with and taunts. I noticed while I was watching the final conflict that you have 3 films and 3 cardigans with collars on. The Thorn men really dig a collared cardie. I love Old Nick the Pike. I wish we'd seen the fish. I just fucking love the idea of Damien, since the age of 5, having a long-standing frenemy like Old Nick. And it being a pike is basically, you couldn't have chosen a more perfect fish to represent that. And I don't normally talk about posters, but the picture of Damien brandishing the dagger of Megiddo, with his head haloed half in fire with the 3 sixes and half by the presidential seal, is an outstanding piece of iconography. The ending is bonkers as all hell, but I guess if you're accepting, if your starting premise is, yeah, the Book of Revelations is all true, the only real way to end it is with the second coming. I think it's a little bit of a damp squib right at the end. Very strange directorial decision or an acting decision when Damien gets stabbed. The scream he gives and the face is a little bit lackluster, punched up because they put some distorted electronic screams on there, and then just a little optical effect to bring the risen Christ in. Again, it felt like they were perhaps a little bit embarrassed by the material. I wish they'd have really gone for it. I wish they'd have gone Toby Hooper life force levels of, right, we're just going to go nuts with this. It's the second coming of Christ, the death of the Antichrist. In the end, the Battle of Armageddon is hidden from public eyes and over in a flash, and maybe that's a commentary on events behind the headlines and behind the politics and the business and the geopolitical maneuverings. These dark supernatural forces are going on out of the sight of men and women. So you could argue it felt like it needed more. But that said, honestly, if you love your horror film history, how can you condemn a film that has an uncredited cameo by Hazel Court? She's the woman at the start of the fox hunt that hands the champagne to one of the riders. This would be Hazel Court, she of The Curse of Frankenstein, The Premature Burial, The Raven, and best of all, The Mask of the Red Death. We're not worthy. I'm not going to talk about Omen IV: The Awakening. I don't own it, and frankly, I don't want it in the house. I was going to do a video on the 2006 remake, but unless you really, really, really want me to, I was going to talk about a film next week that I actually like. A film that I really love.